Yes, thank you very much, Gabi, and also thanks to Hannes, Jonathan, and Oliver for all of your presentations. It was a little bit scientific maybe at the end, but what really struck me is that it was altogether very practical and very focused on how can we improve decision making by different businesses and how can we support them to do that. So Hannah started about SMEs, and then you, Gabi, took over, brought it more to the corporate sector. Jonathan continued that, and Oliver brought tools that are available to all of these. So one of the key questions that comes back into my mind, and maybe Hannes, you can talk on this a little bit first, is that if you see all the available tools and you see the urgency to really embed the value of biodiversity of nature in business decision making, but yet if you're an SME, is there a business case to do that? And so Hannes, what is your experience? The SMEs that you're working with, do they immediately see the business case, or what's the best entry point to get them behind your narrative? Can you share your experience and narrative a little bit on that topic?
Thank you, Martin, for a very good question. And I think two words, in fact, that you've said that are the most important here is business case. And it all rotates around the business case. And the fact of the matter is there is no business case for biodiversity. There is no business case for resource efficiency. There is no business case for any kind of environmental measure, really. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Europe, Africa, or anywhere else in the world. Honestly, there is no strong business case. And I'm speaking quite generically. Of course, in some cases there is, but in general, there is not the business case. The SMEs are faced with being squeezed by their buyers. The buyers squeeze the SMEs for every last bit of productivity they can get out of them. And no, they don't prioritize resource efficiency, biodiversity, or anything else in their procurement requirements. Now, this is a bit strange because at the end of the day, if we look right up at the top of the supply chain, those big consumer-facing companies that all talk about their ESG ratings, we have all the different reporting initiatives. The reality is they want, I suppose, to improve their ESG rating. Let's just call it that for the moment. But they have no idea how to communicate this to their suppliers. They have no idea how to engage with their suppliers because their suppliers exist on many, many different levels. And they may have a relationship with what's called their tier one suppliers, those that supply directly to the buyer. But of course, behind that tier one supplier, there are many, many more suppliers all the way down that entire value chain. And they have no contact with them. They have no way of engaging with them. And if they do incentivize with a business case, their tier one suppliers, they have no ability to incentivize the ones behind us. So you need a knock-on impact. You need a way to say, I incentivize you, but you have to incentivize your supplier. You have to incentivize your supplier. It's a very coordinated action. And until we have that, there is no business case. Buyers often also compete within the same supply chain. So let's say, for example, in the textile industry, buyers will very often, 2 or 3 big brands will buy from the same supplier way down the supply chain. So they're actually competing against each other when it comes to that. And then also within the large companies, those buyers, there's often a disconnect between the sustainability division and the procurement division. Sustainability division is following a business strategy, which is let's be great. Procurement division, cut costs, and it's not connected to sustainability. So you have a lot of things to do. You have to address it within the large companies. You have to find a way to communicate right down the supply chain, and then you might slowly begin to have a business case. But that's what we're up against. There is no business case, and it is probably the biggest blockage to all of this, because how do you get hundreds of thousands and millions of SMEs to go, yes, great idea, I want to do it, without being pushed by one of us? It's the business case from the buyer. So that's the negative side of the whole thing. The positive side is, yeah, I search to find one sometimes.
So thanks, Hannes. it is good sometimes to bring the more critical conclusion, like there is no business case because there are not the right incentives for the SMEs. That's more or less what you said. We should incentivize them to do the right thing. So I want to bring you in on this, Jonathan, coming from the stock exchange in Johannesburg. Stock exchanges know everything about what really incentivize people, and you shared the experience with the voluntary guidance on disclosure, and voluntary popped up a couple of times on your slides as well as in your talks. But if we look to the incentivizing that really is needed, and we see that a lot of the dependencies that you spoke on are really for free to get or for hardly anything. We don't pay that much for resources in a lot of cases. And so resource use sometimes is arguably quite free, and we should start working on that to make it less cheap to do and make the more sustainable actions cheaper instead. So is this something where we should leave the voluntary elements, Jonathan? Do you think, or would you see other ways to incentivize SMEs to become nature positive?
Thanks, Martin, and thanks, Hannes. I mean, I'm not sure I'd be quite as negative, Hannes, about the lack of a business case. Maybe that's more for SMEs. I don't think there is a sufficient business case, but I wouldn't say there is absolutely no business case. Certainly, a key challenge is we're not pricing resources, so that's absolutely clear, and that's one of the great big problems that we have, around climate and other issues. And that's what integrated reporting has sought to do, is to get companies to really understand their dependencies on the natural and human and social capital, and to really seek to interrogate that. But until we price those resources effectively, until we price those externalities effectively, it's going to be hard to get the system change that we need. And that is a role for government. You're absolutely right. And I think it's a great shame that the global financial crisis we had in 2008, we didn't use that opportunity to address some of the deep structural flaws that we have in the market system. So what we also need is some of the business leaders get this. Some of the business leaders are really seeing the impacts of lack of access to natural resources, challenges around social capital, and they're seeking to drive broader regulatory change. Perhaps not as fast and as widespread as we could have. In terms of the JSE, and just to be clear, I'm only a consultant to them and just help with guidance as I don't work at the JSE. It was interesting in the feedback is we had a number of comments both from investors and from NGOs that this guidance should be more either mandatory or that there should be some accountability mechanism. So there are expectations from across the spectrum that we should seek to drive this. And I think it's going to happen. I mean, the IFRS standards, I think, will become a listing requirement on sustainability. The European sustainability reporting standards, that's going to become a requirement. And some of the big companies are driving these things. So a bit like Hannes said, there are going to be expectations. You want to have access to markets, you're going to have to be showing what you're doing in certain areas. Unfortunately, even though biodiversity is arguably a more pressing and more immediate issue than climate change, it's not the charismatic species. It's not getting the attention it should do. It doesn't. I don't think people really understand it. It seemed to be a little bit scientific, if you like. And so it's climate. And Gabby, you said earlier, perhaps there was too much focus on social issues. Actually, I think there hasn't been enough, especially in this country. We really need to focus on social issues. It's climate change, and that seems to be it. And that's very short-sighted. So that's a range of answers. I think we're beginning to see a business case. We won't get it to scale until we internalize those externalities, until we have regulatory reform. Although sadly, governments, as I think you've said earlier, aren't showing the leadership we need. Some governments anyway. And so, on climate change, we brought the CDP to this country 2007, long before government was expecting companies to disclose. We've got 80 of the top 100 voluntarily disclosing on climate change emissions, 10 years before anything, or 15 years before any government action on disclosure. So sometimes the private sector leads, but on the scale of internalizing those costs is huge, and we are going to need more intervention from government.
Yes, thank you very much for this, Jonathan, and also for bringing up the element of mandatory disclosure. And so this is one of the key points. Business for Nature. I'm part of Business for Nature, which is the global business community really arguing and pressing for an ambitious outcome of the nature negotiations, and front-running businesses call for these mandatory requirements because it will help to create a level playing field. Front-runners are already doing it, but also it will help push further the standardization and the creating the data sets that are needed for businesses to assess and disclose their impacts and dependencies. So that one of the key discussions there is, should it be mandatory only for the corporates or also for SMEs? And this is, I think, bringing in an interesting element. What can be the role of corporates to help the SMEs within their supply chain? Because they collaborate and they need each other. They also need, I'm from Europe, in the European context, the corporates will need the understanding of the impacts and dependencies of the SMEs in their supply chain in order to be able to report. So this kind of triggers a collaboration at a supply chain level between SMEs and corporates. And maybe this is something, Gabi, you could step into and share your thoughts on how a collaboration between different parts of the business community with maybe the support of your organization can help to create also a good starting point for SMEs to embark on this voyage.
Absolutely, thanks, Martin. And I think it is critical to point out that companies have been very reticent to have open conversations, understandably. And I think what we've seen and how we've tried to tackle the problem is exactly as you say, with having shared learning and shared knowledge. And what we're doing is looking at it from a sectoral specific way. So we established recently the Mining and Biodiversity Working Group, where we're bringing some of the largest and smallest mining companies into the conversation together to share some of their experiences, build a business case. And one of the things that really came out of that was the need for cross-border, both pollination in terms of learning, but also collaboration. And it was quite uplifting, I think, to hear about how some of these very large mining companies want to actually work together in the landscape. They recognize that their boundaries are not ecological boundaries. And working within the same region, specifically when it comes to resource extraction, can be incredibly beneficial and incredibly cost saving. I give the example that, some of the companies are talking about they have to restore wetlands on some of their operations, and they will spend a lot of money restoring a wetland within their direct operations. And then further downstream, agriculture may be pumping tons of nitrates and polluting the water before that water stream then goes into the next mine to then be kind of rehabilitated. And having this geographic, almost watershed landscape approach will save everyone a lot of money by working together. But we do need people to open up that conversation and have willing participants showing the way. And I use the example of the mining sector. I know you asked about SMEs, and it's certainly not the case here, but there has to be leadership shown, and there has to be the business case, as you've mentioned, demonstrated. And I think mining companies have a pretty tricky track record, particularly in Southern Africa and Africa in general. And they have a real responsibility now, potentially, to demonstrate leadership in the space. We're also working on sector kind of specific working groups for agroforestry, which I think will bring in very small scale producers, where they can be uplifted. We can share technology. We can share very basic things such as data and how to even derive maps or how to report and equip some of these companies on their journeys. So I think this takes a lot of time. I I know the urgency around the CBD and the negotiations seems to have waned a little bit. And that's what worries me, is that the urgency to demonstrate effective leadership in this space and the urgency to undertake real effective change has seemed to slip by. I don't know if you agree with that, Martin, or not from your perspective.
No, it is an interesting question. 2020 was supposed to be the year of biodiversity. Well, it didn't happen, and now it's 2022. And fortunately, the final round of negotiations at the highest political level now is scheduled for December this year. So hopefully it will happen. Although the outcome of the negotiations were not yet that good, I think, last week. I even read in the Dutch newspaper this morning that there is a rumor that there might be another negotiation round in August in Washington. So that, I mean, if it indicates something, it's the eagerness that we really see the need to conclude these negotiations. I like a lot what you say about a sectoral approach, and not only sectoral, but also cross-sectoral and cross-boundaries, focusing on either landscapes or watersheds. That's where a lot of things come together. And I think Oliver is online now. And so what I wonder is, in these sectoral, cross-sectoral, cross-boundary collaborations, you need tools that kind of speak to the minds of the different sectors and the different sides of a border. And I wonder if he can point at one or two of the tools that you use very frequently, that you see are really helpful for businesses to collaborate around, to share knowledge and understanding about how they together are impacting and depending on specific natural resources. So, Oliver, are you indeed online, and can you pick up this question? Yes, you are.
Yeah, I'm here. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you, Martin. So the space I've been working in for the last couple of years has been very much prior to the development of these large-scale things. I'm working on the environmental impact assessment side of things, but from the biodiversity point of view. And the screening tool that I mentioned has been a major step forward in that regard, as it's quite tailored to the different sectors. So when you're putting in your request or your screening proposal, it's very much dependent. You select right at the beginning what sector you're in, whether it's linear infrastructure, whether it's mining, whether it's making roads, whether it is forestry or agriculture. So that just defining what your proposal is at the beginning of the process allows one to tailor the kind of tools that are used to define your footprint. So it really depends on, there are some general things. I mean, most things impact water catchments in some way. Obviously, if there's some sort of direct extraction, then that's a major impact. But as you get further and further into the kind of technicalities of ecology, everything is kind of connected in some way to varying degrees. About sector you work, measure your impacts, but they're not. Excuse me?
Yeah, you were a bit in and out. Not sure whether that's on my side or for the rest also.
It's probably my side. Let me just stop my SharePoint from my uploading. Hopefully that should stabilize the connection a bit. Great, yeah. So the tools are out there, and they can be kind of tailored towards specific sectors, but they still need to be made widely more, not publishable in terms of to scientific journals, but just available, that people that want to access them have them easily user-friendly, accessible. I think what Gabby has been working on quite a lot, she can probably talk more to this than I can, but a kind of easy step-by-step way for companies to, in the various sectors, to calculate their direct environmental or biodiversity footprint. I don't know, Gabby, if you want to speak more to some of your plans you have for that.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. And I think it is a good segue into that. I think the companies are wanting to understand their footprints, and I think I very briefly touched on what a footprint is and what makes a good footprint. And I think what is really relevant to this conversation is we believe in using site-based data. So a lot of the tools that you've been using, Oliver, and the work that's out there is based on site-based data, and that isn't always the case for looking at corporate biodiversity footprints and measurements, particularly of impacts, where a lot of these global models are used. And I think they're very easy to use. I think there's a lot of attraction around them because of their ease of use, their cheap, kind of readily available resources. But particularly in a very biodiverse country, a continent, having site-based data is incredibly important, and that's sometimes not always easy to get. So what we're working on are real monitoring protocols for ecological thresholds and species thresholds, which go into natural capital accounting. And Martin, I think you've also been working on similar things in terms of integrating social and natural capital as well. So I think there's a lot of organizations coming at this from different angles. We're working very much from the bottom up. We believe in site-based data to really reflect management changes on the ground, and avoid greenwashing, where if you want to show that you've restored a wetland, you have to be able to back that up with solid science, and then also communicate that in a way that's easily understandable in a boardroom. So that's where we're really trying to grapple with that. I think communication is one of our biggest challenges. It's not the science. The science is clear. A lot of the willingness is clear. It's communication up and down, which I think we are struggling with. Martin, I don't know if you want to maybe comment on that, to open the floor to that as well.
Yes, and if you allow me, I would like to broaden communication also to skills and the skill set that people have. You're right, as the Capitals Coalition, formerly the Natural Capital Coalition, we've produced guidance, Natural Capital Protocol, a toolkit, specific biodiversity guidance or sectoral guidance. And yes, there are many tools and the metrics are more and more standardized. So they are there. But do the companies and the people within companies, the different experts within a company, do they have the skills to apply these tools? That's one of the questions that is popping up more and more. And that's why we are focusing also more and more on education and providing online courses. So we launched in March an online course on the Coursera platform, which is free for all. If you have 16 hours, so 2 working days, more or less, you can go through the course. It doesn't cost you anything, and you will learn all about assessing and understanding your impacts and dependencies on natural capital. And we will develop a similar course on social and human capital. I will put the link in the chat box. But what I'm wondering, and maybe Hannes, you can come in. One of the things we already found out is that for the ordinary SME, 16 hours is already a lot. So yes, people want to learn, but they also want to learn it quick. Others want to learn a little bit more deep dive, and they are looking for more. So I'm wondering, Johannes, what is your experience on the skills gap within SMEs, and what kind of education are they looking for to strengthen and to empower themselves?
Big question, Martin, I have to admit. But the easiest way to answer that is when it comes to barriers that SMEs face in implementing any kind of environmental based measure, definitely there's always a lack of skills. You could often say it's not complicated, it's just very difficult. I mean, it's not complicated to be environmentally friendly, but to actually achieve it is quite complicated. You need to have a relatively good set of skills to do it. And I suppose what adds to the complication is, what set of skills do you want? Do you want to address biodiversity? Do you want to address emissions? Do you want to address resource efficiency? We have lots of different topics as well that we bombard, I suppose, SMEs with. And the question for them is, what do you want me to do first? Where do I start? What skills should I have? Because each one requires a skill and each one requires time. As you said, 16 hours is a lot for SMEs. And what I want to do is actually give an example. Here in Europe, the European Commission has just launched what's called a Covenant of Companies to address decarbonization in European industry. And I worked with them a little bit on this project. And here in Europe, already we're talking about, even with all our EU regulations, et cetera, time is one of the key things that SMEs don't have. And it's not just time, they don't have the actual time, and they don't have the people to do things. They don't have the skill sets to do it here. And that's one of the biggest challenges for SMEs. How can I take on this whole new topic and deal with it? If I don't have the time myself, I have to contract somebody, and that's a lot of money. But if I contract somebody, they won't give me any skills to continue it with. So when you say what skills, number one is we need to work together, I suppose, to say, where do we start? What is the starting point for an SME? What's the basic skill that they need to have on what topic? And in a way, you could say that the level of skills or the investment they get in those skills should also be connected with the requirements from their buyer. And I think, let me come back to your question about mandatory reporting. I believe that it's good that large companies have mandatory reporting. I don't see any point in trying to impose a regulation which requires mandatory reporting from SMEs, and would be literally impossible to enforce. But if the large company is required to report on its supply chain, and it must gather that information, they will include that into their procurement procedure. And they will say to their tier one supplier, you have to report to me also on your supplier. And it trickles down. And those reporting requirements also dictate what skills the SME needs. So if the reporting requirement is honestly just emissions, well, the SME is going to search for the training on emission reduction. If it's got to do with biodiversity, they will look. But I think the training requirements will be dictated by the procurement requirements that are of the buyer, which are in turn are dictated by the reporting requirements. So I think we have to accept that they're not going to do it on their own, and they need that trickle down push, but it needs to be dictated to them. Where do I start? What's my baseline? What do you want me to report on? Then I know what skills I need.
So it's not complicated, but difficult, you said. I kind of like that.
Not difficult, just, I didn't reverse, but yes, exactly.
No, but I like that. And it kind of shows that, and yes, you can do it, but you have to pay attention to it, which is the case for a lot of things in life. It's not difficult to learn how to drive a car, but you need to go through certain classes and practice it. And personally, I always like the practice element very much. Jonathan, can you come in on Hannes' position where he said, make disclosure mandatory for corporates, but not for SMEs, allow corporates and SMEs to collaborate together and use also the supply chain as well as the procurement of corporates to steer SMEs in the right direction?
Yeah, I would support that. I mean, I think we're seeing it in a number of areas. I'll quote one instance where I think it's going to have quite a big impact, and that's Unilever on a social issue, driving requirements around paying a living wage of their suppliers, from small suppliers to large suppliers. And I think, I hope it's going to have a huge impact in shifting that narrative. I agree that it's probably more direct incentive. It's probably more efficient than relying on government regulation on SMEs. I think Hannes is correct. So yeah, I would support that. And I think we've seen some examples, and I think we're going to see some more. I mean, I was facilitating a discussion the other day with a mining company in the Platinum Group, and we had, okay, but they're not an SME, but it was just interesting working with one of the motor companies was dialing in, and how absolutely clear that in terms of purchasing a PGM metal, it's no longer a question of price and location. It's a question of looking at the legacy issues and a strong distinguishing feature on the environmental and social performance. So you want to sell your platinum group metal to this big auto sector. These guys are driving that change, and often in a pace and scale that's faster than government. So I think we can certainly seek to do that with SMEs as well. And it's happening. You know, we're getting some visionary business leaders, and they're beginning to see the nature of the problems. I mean, I was just with a property company now, and they said they've had 3 100-year heavy rainfall issues in the last 4 years. You know, the narrative has shifted. One of my mining clients has had locust plague stopping the delivery of iron ore off the thing. You know, the narrative has changed. So these things are becoming much more clear, although there's still a willingness to kind of push back on it. It's bizarre. It's a human condition. You know, I was leaving the meeting now, and he said, well, Greta Thunberg, you know, I think there are these rational people that are still questioning some of the science on this. And I said, no, I'm not with you on that one, I'm afraid. But he just didn't want to, you know, they push back on these issues. It's bizarre. So I got sidetracked there, but I think you're right. So I agree with your point. Let's get the big companies to engage suppliers, and it's happening. It's happening.
And thanks, Jonathan. And your positive way of looking at it is, I think, also an excellent way to close down this panel, this discussion. Things really are changing. The focus of this meeting today is all around incorporating nature into all decision making of this at the supply chain level. It's part of a bigger series around innovative pathways for nature positive futures. But you correctly says it's not only about coupling nature to climate, and climate usually gets most of the attention, but it's also about bringing the social element into the equation. Living wage, having a decent wage is a key element for solving all the global challenges as well. And we see gradually the narrative changing. So that is a positive conclusion to end with. I would like to thank all the panelists, Hannes, Jonathan, Gabi, as well as Oliver, for all your valuable contributions. I want to point out that tomorrow there's a final, on Thursday, there's a final plenary session organized by JJKP that will bring together the learnings from today as well as those from other meetings in Africa to a final plenary discussion. So if you're free, please join us in the early afternoon this Thursday. Thank you very much. Gabi, over to you for the final closing down of this session.
Thank you, Martin. And just, yes, echoing your words, I think there is a positive story in amongst everything. I think it's just communicating it with one voice and making sure that we get to the right ears. And with enough metaphors, I'm going to then close off and just thank you everyone for coming to this session today. The videos will be available online to share. I think there were some important tools and tips and discussions here. Please have a look at the conference website. I've left my email address in the chat as well if you want to contact me for any further information. And yes, I think let's end on that positive note and thank you everyone and have a great afternoon further.